The story of Robert Emmet, Oscar Wilde, Jefferson Davis, and the daughter of the Confederacy is one of the most intriguing parts of the whole Emmet legend. It started in 1882 when Oscar Wilde travelled to America on a speaking tour. It was the time when he famously declared at American customs, when they asked, "Do you have anything to declare, sir?" And he said, "No, nothing except my genius." Because 1882 was also the year when there were 20 Emmet commemorations held across the United States. And these coincided with some of Oscar Wilde's trip. He was in Wisconsin, and there the night before, there was a major oration delivered by William Kennedy, who said that success in life has a double meaning. And in its higher and nobler and better sense, Emmet's life was a preeminent success. And Wilde arrived in Wisconsin the very next day and he said, "If I'd known about this Robert Emmet event, I would have cancelled my own lecture and I would have attended it." And while he was there, he visited a kinsman of the Emmets to pay his respects and to offer a tribute to the Emmet family. Because it's funny, Oscar Wilde loved failure. He found something intriguing, intoxicating about it. It was more interesting than success. So perhaps it was not surprising that he found something interesting, something to admire in the story of Robert Emmet. He also found it very interesting to reflect on America's recent past and the Civil War. And he found his sympathies, especially when he was touring the South, were with the Confederacy. Speaking in New Orleans, he said, "The head must approve the success of the winners, but the heart is surely to be with the fallen." And he received massive applause in New Orleans when he said, "The case of the South in the Civil War was, to my mind, much like that of Ireland today. It was a struggle for autonomy, self-government for a people." And this went down very well. And afterwards, when asked by reporters what Wilde wanted to do while he was in the United States, he said he only wanted to do one thing. He only wanted to meet one man, and that man was Jefferson Davis. And so a meeting was arranged between the two of them. It was described by someone there as being like a butterfly making a formal visit to an eagle. Jefferson Davis did not like Wilde. He said simply, coldly, afterwards, "I did not like him." But Oscar Wilde did make a considerable impression on Jefferson Davis's daughter, Verena Ann Davis, the woman who had been idolised and idealised during the Civil War as the daughter of the Confederacy. And Wilde found much to talk to about Irish history and about the events of the Civil War with Verena Ann, Winnie Davis. And Winnie Davis found much to consider in that story. She found many similarities. There were stories that an ancestor of hers had actually fought alongside Emmet in 1803 and then afterwards had fled to the United States. So she determined to write the history of Robert Emmet, and she wrote a book, An Irish Knight of the 19th Century. And that book was a big success in America and is credited with reviving the Emmet story to a wider audience, for bringing it to a new generation of people. And in it, Winnie Davis drew many links between Emmet and his rebellion in Ireland in 1803 and the work of her father and the Confederacy, that both were lost causes, both were glorious events, both were brave men attempting to protect their civilization from attack from outside. And although both had failed, failure was not the only judge in life. They had achieved a greater victory, a greater success. And in a way, the Emmet story was recast to suit a South mythologizing of the events of the Civil War and the civilization which they claimed had been changed by it. So some of this is laughable, but yet that book proved a big success in America. And so the story of Winnie Davis, Oscar Wilde and Jefferson Davis and Emmet became an important part of the Emmet mythology. You see how powerful the Emmet story is in America in 1914 when Roger Casement visited Philadelphia. Crowds greeted him, shouting, "Robert Emmet, Robert Emmet, you are the new Robert Emmet." He wrote afterwards saying that the people were mad for another Irish Protestant leader, another Irish Protestant hero. When he was arrested and put on trial, Sir Edward Grey considered putting him in a lunatic asylum rather than executing him. Sir Edward Grey was the Foreign Secretary. He said, "We should lock him up, put him in a lunatic asylum. We have enough evidence with the diaries. Don't make him a martyr. Otherwise, he will be hailed as the new Robert Emmet." Before Roger Casement set out on that doomed mission on the submarine in 1916 to try and cancel the 1916 Rising, a mission that I think he must have known would end in his capture and death. Well, before he set out, a friend came to him and gave him a copy of Emmet's speech from the dock. And he handed it back without looking at it, saying, "Alas, I know that speech only far too well." Woodrow Wilson was someone who had an interest in Emmet. Wilson had visited Ireland in 1899. He had gone straight to Trinity College because his great hero was Edmund Burke, and he wanted to spend his days wandering around the quads, his thoughts full of Burke. And while he was there, he heard about the story of Robert Emmet. And years later, he was involved in some of these Emmet commemorative events. However, by the time he was president, Robert Emmet had become a tricky subject for him because he didn't want to do anything and he didn't want to say anything that might alienate the British, especially as, from 1917, America and Britain were fighting on the same side together. And so, when there was an unveiling of a statue in 1917 to Robert Emmet, he insisted on the speeches being cut. Count John McCormick sang a few songs, but he didn't want any glorification of Emmet, of rebellion, of anything that might show a difference with the British. And when in 1918 he was presented with a replica statue of Robert Emmet by a Fenian group which had been established for that purpose, he was furious when one of the men there delivered a speech praising Emmet and attacking British rule. The man said, "Robert Emmet was a poor potter and he died for his country. He said that Ireland was the most oppressed country in history, but it would soon get its freedom." And Wilson was furious when he heard these words. He was shaking with anger and he said, "That man," who was an American citizen, "that man Phelan, he is committing treason. You cannot say those things. This is disgusting." And in it, afterwards he gave a very interesting response, similar to the speech that he had given on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, when Union and Confederate soldiers had lined up together side by side and had shaken hands. And Wilson gave a speech where he said, "Isn't it great that we are all gathered here together? The quarrel forgot." In other words, you can mention the Civil War, you can meet and shake hands as friends, but don't mention what the war was about. Certainly don't mention slavery, because then you're just going to start things up again. And historians in America reflecting on that have said, well, you would never have seen that happening on the 50th anniversary of D-Day. You never would have seen for the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings, German soldiers putting on their Nazi uniforms, Nazi veterans putting on those uniforms and going to the Normandy beach and meeting all the British and American soldiers in their uniforms, and the veterans lining up side by side and shaking hands, and an American president giving a speech saying, "Isn't it great that we're all here as friends? The quarrel forgot." Because people would have said, no, we need to remember the quarrel. That's a very important quarrel. But Wilson didn't want to do that for the American Civil War. And he took the same attitude of self-forgetfulness to the Robert Emmet story in 1918. He gave a speech where he said that what Robert Emmet did in his time would not be necessary to do in our time. But we can, all of us, appreciate, without any partisanship of any kind, the spirit of a man like that, the spirit of self-forgetfulness, the spirit of devotion, the spirit of idealism, the spirit which leads a man to go to the full length of sacrifice for the purpose which he holds most dear. Now, what exactly does that mean? Who knows? In other words, you can honour Emmet, but you honour him as a man. You don't acknowledge the cause. The quarrel forgot, and we move on. But for Verena Ann Davis, Winnie Davis, Emmet was the symbol of the quarrel remembered, the lost cause, the idea of the struggle that must go on. She tied it in with the Confederate mythologising, and she tied it in to the Irish mythologising. And certainly in Ireland, that was to prove a potent force in the 19th and 20th century.